Neville Goddard's thought process begins with a simple but precise idea. Understanding does not occur through constant effort, repetition, or correction, but through allowing an assumption to settle. The phrase, "just listen and let it lock," names this process directly. In Neville's framework, listening does not mean passive hearing, and it does not mean obedience. It refers to receiving an idea without immediately testing it, modifying it, or arguing with it. What locks in is not information, but a position of mind. Neville describes imagination as the central faculty through which assumptions take form. Feeling, in his usage, is not emotion, but the sense of reality attached to an idea once it is no longer treated as provisional. When an idea is still being adjusted, it remains external. When adjustment stops, it becomes internal. This is the point Neville identifies as understanding. The claim is not that listening causes change by itself, but that without mental settling, no change can be organized at all. For Neville's model to function, a foundational assumption must be accepted. That assumption is that consciousness is shaped primarily by receptivity rather than by active control. The model assumes that the mind already has the capacity to organize experience, and that interference arises from constant evaluation and correction. You are asked to notice how quickly the mind reacts to new ideas by comparing, qualifying, or postponing them. In Neville's framework, these reactions prevent ideas from stabilizing. Listening, therefore, is not inactivity. It is the suspension of immediate response. The assumption is that when the mind does not interfere, ideas register more deeply. Locking in requires that the idea be allowed to stand as it is, without being turned into a task or a question. This assumption reverses common habits of learning, where effort is emphasized. Here, effort is understood as the source of instability rather than progress. Neville's explanation of how ideas lock in is psychological rather than mystical. He treats assumption as a mental state that becomes fixed when it is no longer rehearsed as a possibility. While an idea is still being repeated deliberately, it remains unsettled. Once repetition stops, familiarity replaces effort. You are asked to notice how familiar ideas feel obvious and unquestioned, even if they were once uncertain. In Neville's framework, feeling refers to this sense of normalcy. Emotional intensity is irrelevant. What matters is that the idea no longer calls attention to itself. At that point, attention reorganizes automatically. Behavior, interpretation, and expectation adjust without conscious direction. Neville does not describe this as forcing belief. He describes it as the natural result of mental acceptance. The question his model raises is not how to convince the mind, but how the mind decides that something no longer needs to be considered. Although Neville emphasizes effortlessness, his model still requires discipline, but of a specific kind. Discipline is not used to create an assumption, but to prevent its disturbance. You are asked to observe how often the mind revisits settled ideas in order to check, correct, or reinforce them. In Neville's view, this revisiting weakens stability, rather than strengthening it. Discipline of attention means disengaging from unnecessary mental commentary. Repetition matters only until familiarity is achieved. After that point, repetition becomes interference. The role of discipline is to notice when attention drifts back into analysis and to allow it to return to stillness. This is not framed as self-control, but as selective participation. The model assumes that attention amplifies what it touches. Discipline, therefore, consists in withdrawing attention from contradiction, not in suppressing it. Neville's model of causation follows directly from these assumptions. He does not propose that inner states directly produce external events through force. Instead, he describes causation as the maintenance of coherence between inner position and experienced sequence. Once an assumption is fixed, perception and behavior align with it. This alignment produces outcomes that appear consistent with the assumption. From within the model, experience follows inner state because interpretation precedes response. You are not asked to believe that events are controlled directly. You are asked to see how internal consistency organizes experience over time. Effort operates at the level of assumption, not at the level of outcomes. Once coherence is established, outcomes are interpreted as natural extensions rather than achievements. The model remains internally consistent even if its claims are treated purely as psychological observations. Neville's framework reflects a broader historical pattern. Across philosophical and psychological traditions, thinkers have repeatedly emphasized that inner orientation precedes action and perception. While the language differs, the structure remains similar. Humans have long observed that certainty stabilizes behavior, while uncertainty fragments it. Neville's contribution is to describe this stabilization as a function of imagination and assumption rather than external authority. The idea that absorbed beliefs guide action more reliably than debated ones is not new. What is distinctive is Neville's insistence that belief formation is passive rather than active. By locating causation inside consciousness, he aligns his model with long-standing inner-first explanations of experience. This continuity helps explain why the framework feels familiar even when its terminology is unfamiliar. In Neville's model, perception does not operate as an objective recorder of reality. It functions as a filter organized around assumption. You are asked to notice how relevance changes depending on what you already accept as true. Once an idea is locked in, perception highlights confirming information and minimizes contradiction. This process is not deliberate. It reflects how attention naturally organizes experience. Neville does not argue that reality is created from nothing. He argues that experience is structured through interpretation. What appears stable is stable because the reference point has stabilized. The model does not deny external conditions. It explains why they are experienced differently depending on internal position. Perception, in this framework, reinforces assumption rather than testing it. Agency, as Neville defines it, is exercised at the point of reception rather than at the point of action. You are responsible for what you allow to enter consciousness without resistance. Once an idea is locked in, agency becomes less visible because behavior follows automatically. This does not remove responsibility. It relocates it. Responsibility is not defined as managing every outcome, but as maintaining internal coherence. The model assumes that once internal conflict is reduced, action becomes consistent without effort. Agency operates before behavior, not during it. This redefinition challenges common ideas of control but remains internally logical. Choice, in this framework, ends when the assumption is accepted. After that, processes unfold without supervision. Neville Goddard's idea of just listen and let it lock in describes a specific organization of the mind. It outlines how receptivity, assumption, attention, and perception interact to form a closed internal system. The framework does not ask for belief, agreement, or rejection. It asks only for structural understanding. When the parts of the model are seen in relation to one another, its internal logic becomes clear. Listening allows entry. Settling allows stability. Stability allows coherence. Whether one accepts the implications or not, the system explains itself on its own terms. What remains at the end is not instruction or conclusion, but a clear view of how Neville Goddard understood the relationship between inner experience and lived continuity.